welcome to another edition of Vocabulary Matters. Today we're going to read an article about a recent breakthrough in the development of a malaria vaccine. So, as usual, we'll read it together and then we'll look at some of the interesting vocabulary and talk about that and help you understand it. If you want to download the text, you can find the link in the video description. And of course, you can skip to a word that you're particularly interested in by clicking on the chapters. So let's begin reading. A cheap malaria vaccine that can be produced on a massive scale has been recommended for use by the World Health Organization. The vaccine, called R21, is only the second malaria vaccine to be developed. Malaria kills mostly babies and infants, and has been one of humanity's biggest scourges. The first malaria vaccine, called RTS-S and developed by GSK, was backed by the WHO in 2021. However, it has limited availability and a high cost. So let's go through some of the words. The first one we have highlighted here is the noun scale. Now, as most words, it has many different uses and different meanings. I'm going to highlight some of those for you and tell you which one is relevant. So the first one that comes to mind is connected with fish. There are different animals. For example, humans have skin. We're covered with skin. A lot of other mammals are covered with hair or fur, as it's sometimes called. And many fish are covered with scales. So this is kind of like the skin of the fish. Now, not all fish have scales, of course. Sharks, for example, don't, but many do. The obvious one I can think of is a salmon. If you've ever cooked a piece of salmon and you look at the skin of the salmon, you can see individual scales on that. Similarly, in past times, there used to be a kind of protection for soldiers called scale armor, which kind of imitated the scales found on a fish, but in metal. So that they would protect people from being attacked by swords or arrows and things like that. Okay, now another use of this word scale is when we think of weighing things. If I want to weigh myself, if I want to find out how much I weigh, then I can stand on a machine, and that machine is called scales, usually in the plural. The original device for weighing actually had two elements in it, and you would balance it to find out how much something weighed. Now, of course, a lot of them are electronic, but the name is the same. Scales. We have bathroom scales for weighing your weight, and we have kitchen scales for weighing products that we're going to cook. For example, the ingredients if you're baking a cake or something like that. Finally, we can also talk about the scale of a map or a model. Now, if we think of a map, usually a map is a representation of a specific area of the globe, the Earth. And obviously, maps are drawn to scale. That means that they do not represent the same dimensions on the paper as in reality. There is a scale involved here. So, for example, perhaps 1 centimeter on the map could represent several kilometers in real life. And usually at the bottom of the map, you can see the scale, which tells you the ratio of the different measurements. The same kind of concept is used when you're building a model. If an architect is building a model of a building, that model will also be usually produced to a fixed scale in a similar way to the map. And if we talk about scaling something up, to use a phrasal verb, that basically means to increase something. For example, if you're talking about manufacturing, if you're scaling up the manufacturing something, you're going from small scale, so producing relatively few things, to large scale. you're producing a lot more. And that is really the meaning that is relevant here in the article, because it's talking about producing this malaria vaccine on a massive scale. So one of the advantages of this vaccine is that it can be scaled up, it can be produced massively and relatively cheaply, which is a big advantage if you're going to vaccinate a lot of people. So moving on to the second word. Now, this is a very interesting word, a little unusual perhaps, but it is used fairly frequently when we're talking mostly about bad things. Because if we go back to the origin of this word, a scourge was in fact a tool, if you like, or a device which was used for punishment. It was very similar to a whip, and it was used to hit people, to punish them. And nowadays, of course, we don't use this, thankfully, but we do still use the word in a figurative sense. So if we say that something is a scourge of humanity, it's in a similar way to the original meaning, something that was very bad for you, for your body. Today, we would use it to mean something that's very bad for humanity or society in some way. For example, we could say that COVID, that recent viral epidemic that the whole world has endured, was definitely a global scourge. It affected millions of people in a very bad way and disrupted the economy on a global scale. So this is definitely a good example of a scourge. And if we talk in more general terms, we could talk about poverty or war being also a scourge on humanity because of their very negative effects. So let's move on to the second paragraph now. The new R21 vaccine has similar effectiveness to the previous vaccine, but is easier to manufacture and cheaper. The World Health Organization said the new R21 vaccine would be a vital additional tool in the fight against malaria, which killed 619,000 people in 2021. The R21 vaccine also met a key benchmark set by the WHO for malaria vaccines, to have at least 75% efficacy against severe malaria, which can cause organ failure, coma, and death. The R21 vaccine prevented 77% of severe malaria cases in the trial. Severe malaria is responsible for most of the deaths from the disease. So, in this paragraph, we have three words highlighted. Let's start with the first one here, which is a noun, a tool. And we talk here about a vital additional tool in the fight against malaria. If we think about the basic meaning of this word, then the first thing that comes to my mind are tools that I use when I do certain jobs around the house. For example, if I want to put up a shelf, I want to attach a shelf to the wall, then I will need certain tools to enable me to do that. For example, I would need a drill in order to make holes in the wall, and I would also need a screwdriver in order to fix the shelf to the wall using screws. So a screwdriver and a drill are both examples of tools. They are devices, machines that are used for a very specific purpose in order to do a particular job. Now, there are tools for doing almost anything you can imagine. For example, if I want to cut a piece of wood, I would use a saw. But there are literally hundreds of different ones. Each one has its own special function. And in this case, it's used slightly figuratively. It's talking about the vaccine being a tool. So it is something that is going to be very useful for this fight against this terrible disease, malaria. So let's move on to the second word here. This is a really interesting word, and it is pronounced benchmark. And in this case, it's a noun. It can also be used as a verb as well. Um, but the origin of this word actually goes back to professionals which are called surveyors. A surveyor was responsible for making measurements, very accurate measurements, sometimes of the land, for example. If they wanted to make a map, they would first have to make very precise measurements of the location of different features of the landscape and also the relative heights above sea level. And a benchmark was originally a real mark or position that was used as the basis for taking very precise measurements. And we conserve a little bit of that meaning in the modern use of the word, because today when we talk of a benchmark, we are talking about a standard that is used for measuring other things. So it's something that is well known. It's a figure or an amount or a particular quality that is known and can be measured very precisely. And therefore, when we want to measure something else and we want to compare it, we can compare it to that benchmark, and we can get a good view of the relative effectiveness, for example, of a vaccine. So in this case, the benchmark that was set by the World Health Organization was a minimum of 75% efficacy. So obviously, that's the benchmark. So when we measure the efficacy of a vaccine that has been developed, it has to meet that threshold. There's a word from another video. That is the minimum amount that is acceptable. Any more would be great, but if it meets that benchmark, then it's passed, if you like. Benchmarking is also commonly used in computing these days. If you've just bought a new graphics processor, a new GPU, and you want to test it in your system to see how it performs, then you might use benchmarking software. So that software usually involves testing the components of your system by running a series of programs, usually graphically very intensive, and it gives you a score at the end. That score can be compared to other systems with different GPUs or different setups, and that benchmark will give you an idea of how well your system is performing compared to others. So remember, therefore, that a benchmark is fundamentally a standard. It's used for comparing things, and it's a way of measuring performance, let's say. And it's used in many different ways, particularly in industry. When we talk of an industry benchmark, many companies may compare their products to that industry benchmark to get an idea of how well they are performing. So let's move on to the third and final word in this paragraph, which is responsible. Responsible is an adjective, and it commonly goes with the preposition for. So think about a job. Okay, if I'm a manager in a company, I have certain responsibilities. Those are the things that I have to do as part of my job. We could call them duties, if you like. I may be responsible for looking after my employees and for reaching certain targets that I may have, for example, in sales or other things like that. If I am a teacher, then I am responsible for educating my students, right? I'm responsible for making sure that they are learning and doing well in class and in exams. So in both of those examples, if you're in a position of authority, you have control, you also have duties and responsibilities. And those are the things that you are responsible for doing. In English, we sometimes say the buck stops here, right? You are the person in charge, so you are responsible for making sure that this, whatever it is, happens. The Government, for example, in many countries is responsible for providing a lot of key services, of course. In the UK government is responsible for providing basic national health service to everybody. It's their responsibility to make sure that the system is working correctly. And if it isn't, then they will be accountable for that failure. People will want to know why they haven't done it. They're also responsible for keeping the streets clean, for keeping them safe, for funding the police, and many, many other things. A responsible person, therefore, would be somebody who is very good at performing their job, doing their duty, and working in an autonomous way. You can trust a responsible person because you know that they are very competent. Whereas an irresponsible person is the exact opposite. Okay, you wouldn't trust them because you just don't know if they're going to do what they should be doing, because they essentially don't care. Now, in this case, in the article, we're using the word responsible slightly differently from those cases because we're not talking about a person. Okay, we're talking about a disease, malaria. What it says is severe malaria is responsible for most of the deaths from the disease. So it's saying that severe malaria is to blame. That is the cause for most of the deaths. In a similar way, you could say that climate change perhaps is responsible for increasing levels of poverty in certain parts of the world. When people are suffering from droughts or floods or other phenomenon that are linked to global warming, then we can say that the global warming is to blame for, or at least in part to blame for their poverty. So it is responsible for that. Moving on to the next paragraph then. Malaria is caused by a complex parasite which is spread by the bite of blood-sucking mosquitoes. It hides from our immune system by constantly shape-shifting inside the human body. That makes it hard to build up immunity naturally through catching malaria, and difficult to develop a vaccine. This is a momentous achievement for public health. We are very grateful to all our partners who have supported us along this journey and look forward to working with them to ensure this vaccine reaches those who need it most, said Professor Adrian Hill of Oxford University. So let's start by looking at the verb spread here. In this case, it's used in the passive. The essential meaning of the verb to spread, which I should mention is also an irregular verb, spread, 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 is that something is being extended over a larger area. So if we think of a tablecloth, okay, which is a piece of material that is usually used to cover a table and to protect it from food, we often use the word spread. We spread the tablecloth over the table. So we extend it, we open it up, and we put it all over that surface. Equally, we can talk about spreading butter on bread. In some parts of the world, like that which I'm from in the UK, we often eat toasted bread for breakfast, and many people like to spread butter on the bread, on the toast, and sometimes people even spread jam on it as well, which is made from fruit. So that means you're extending the butter and the jam all over the surface of that. Also, we can talk about spreading lies even, or spreading false information. That's another use of the word spread. In a similar way, the lies or the false information passes from one person to another, and it extends over a large area. We can often talk about things going viral on the internet. In a similar way, that means that perhaps a meme, which is very popular, is passed on to another person, and it gradually, or sometimes very quickly, spreads throughout the whole internet. in a similar way that viruses spread. That's why we say it's gone viral, because of course, as pretty much everybody in the world knows from recent history, the COVID virus started somewhere in China and eventually spread to the whole world, just about. And many millions of people came into contact with that. So obviously, in this case, that is the usage that we are looking at here, because it's talking about how malaria is spread from person to person, and it is spread by the mosquitoes. Actually, the mosquitoes are the vector, so they bite you and they pass on the parasite which is living inside them. And it's that parasite which actually causes the malaria disease. Okay, so let's move on to the second word, and this is a phrasal verb, to build up. And the article talks about building up immunity. So this phrasal verb is not particularly difficult because, unlike some of the others, it is kind of connected with the basic meaning of the verb build. When we build something, we are essentially constructing something, putting elements together to make it bigger. When you build a building, of course, you may use bricks or concrete to do that. Similarly, when you're building up something, you are increasing it in size or in strength. So if I've just started a business, the business will be very small. And hopefully, if my business is successful, I will be able to build it up over a number of years and increase it in size and be successful. Equally, if I go to the gym every day and I train intensively, I will be able to build up my strength. In this case, it's talking about building up immunity, and the fact that that is very difficult because of the way the parasite is constantly changing inside the human body. That makes it very difficult for the immune system to increase its capacity to fight it. So moving on to the penultimate word here, we have the adjective grateful. This is an adjective that is usually used, associated with expressions of gratitude. So if we want to thank somebody, we often say, I'm very grateful for your help. Maybe you have given me a hand in a project at work. Then I may say to that person, thank you, I'm very grateful for your help. Sometimes, as a sign of gratitude, we may buy a present or a gift. Really, this is a synonym of thankful as well. And in this case, the professor, Adrian Hill, is expressing the fact that he is grateful for all of the partners, colleagues, etc., who have supported him and helped him. Finally, we have this phrase here, to look forward to. Another phrasal verb, and inseparable. Don't forget, all three-word phrasal verbs are inseparable. So after to, which incidentally is a preposition, not an infinitive marker, we can put a noun. So I could say, I am really looking forward to the party this weekend. Or we can put a verb. Now, pay attention. If we put a verb, it must be a gerund. Like in this case, it's the verb working. The reason is because it is a preposition. After a preposition, the verb is always in the gerund form. So people sometimes forget that, because to, of course, can be both a preposition and an infinitive marker. The other thing to be aware of is the fact that there is another phrasal verb, to look for, which looks a little similar. And again, people often confuse the two. Remember, to look for something is the same as to search for it. So if I don't know where I put my phone, I can say, I'm looking for my phone. Where is it? Here, however, we're talking about something completely different. It's nothing to do with searching. Here, the key thing to remember is the direction forward, as opposed to backward. So if you're traveling forward, you're going in the same direction that you are looking, right? And in a similar way, when we are anticipating something. We are kind of looking into the future in that direction. That's what this is all about. It's about anticipating something that is going to happen. So there are two important elements there, okay? The anticipation is important, but also the fact that it's going to happen. So it has to be a plan. Now, a good example for this would be holidays, right? Because holidays are usually planned in advance. And usually we like to think about them before we actually experience them. If you're doing that, we would say, oh, I'm really looking forward to going on holiday this year. That means I'm feeling really happy about it, about thinking about what I'm going to do in the future. Equally, we can sometimes use the same structure here, but in the negative, when we are thinking about things we have to do that we don't enjoy. Now, a good example of this would be something that I don't enjoy and many other people don't enjoy, going to the dentist. Now, it's something that I have to do occasionally to look after my teeth, but I never enjoy it. So I could say to a friend, I'm really not looking forward to going to the dentist on Monday. That means I have to go. It's something I've written in my agenda, but I really don't want to do it. Final thing I'd like to explain about this is that there are actually two different forms for this. Whenever I teach this in class, people often say to me, oh, I recognize that structure because I often use it when I write emails in English. And that is true. It is a common way of finishing an email to say, for example, I look forward to hearing from you soon, or I look forward to meeting you next week. Now, when I say there are two forms, I mean one of them is considered slightly more formal than the other. So if you say, I look forward to, present simple, then it sounds a little bit more formal than if you say, I am looking forward to, present continuous. So just be aware of that if you're using it in writing. But in spoken English, certainly we usually use the present continuous form. So we would say, I'm looking forward to it. In this case, in the article, he is saying, that's Adrian Hill, is saying that he is anticipating that he's going to be working with those colleagues in the future to ensure the vaccine reaches all those who need it. So he is really looking forward to that. Okay, so that's it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you have learned a few new words. If you have, then please don't hesitate to subscribe and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.